Well, first of all, make sure you can hear me. I'd like to express my thanks to the Moran family, to the committee that participated in my selection for this honor, to John Tuttle, who helped hold things together, and for Provost Chapman for that nice introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge the help of 4 people who saw a version of this paper before I delivered it to you today and gave me some advice on how to handle it. First and foremost is Ralph Lee Woodward. He is now living in retirement. He first evaluated my work as an undergraduate student in 1963, and he and I have been working together off and on since then. He read this paper, and generally he approved it. I think he liked parts of it. And he said that he feels that I have some potential, that I should continue to work at this. And so I appreciate his kind comments. And then I also sent a copy to my former roommate as an undergraduate, Charles B. Chuck Neely, who is now an attorney in Raleigh, North Carolina. Chuck and I were roommates 1964 to 65, actually knew each other, I think, for all 4 years. He and I often had lunch together or dinner together with a third fellow named Elisha Erb, who was a law student. And I've often wondered why Elisha Erb got together with these 2 freshmen. I don't know. But we had a nickname for Elisha Erb. We called him Wyatt. Wyatt Erb. And he seemed to like that. But he and Chuck were diametrically opposed on most issues. Chuck was a very conscientious conservative, and Wyatt Earp was a Massachusetts liberal. And so I think a large part of my education as an undergraduate came at the dinner table with those 2 guys, listening to their arguments, which were congenial, but nevertheless pretty deeply rooted. Third person who saw this paper and commented on it was my wife, Kathy. She, I think, was approving of it. She's an expert in grammar and logical thinking. She's been evaluating my work since 1969, many areas. We have a little tradition at home now, empty nest, but sometimes in the mornings, well, every morning, she works on the jumble, which involves really code breaking, reassembling random letters as words. And she's gotten to be very proficient at this. She does it very quickly. But sometimes she will ask me for help. This is at the breakfast table, and she will call on me for help, and she'll read out several letters, 8 or 10 or 12 letters. What word does that spell? And so I dutifully write them down and begin to think. And then she'll say, armadillo. She beats me. Procrastination. Yes, well, I didn't quite make that one either. I've come to call this the morning humiliation, which does wonders for my ego. I mean, it's like having therapy at breakfast. I think Sigmund Freud would entirely approve of this. fourth person who saw this paper was David Nichols, who is in the office of the historian of the U.S. State Department in Washington. Known David for about 10 years. He published, I think, a seminal book called Under the Wire, which deals specifically with this topic. And particularly he emphasized not the technology itself, not the business operations of the companies, but the use to which the telegraph cable was put. And he and I have exchanged emails off and on. And I see him every spring when I go up to Washington for my Library of Congress work. And he responded and was favorable, I think, and advised me on, as he usually does, on some things that he had seen. He's a voracious reader, very wide range of interest, and very helpful. But whatever mistakes are contained herein that you hear about in my speech today, I'll, of course, have to accept blame for that. Don't cast it off on them. But yes, you see up there on the screen an image. And again, I have to express my thanks to Mac McLeod, who made it possible for that image to be there. I had devised a system of storing images and working with them on my computer, which apparently is very secure. It's impossible to move it somewhere else. So I brought my, actually a CD, my laptop, thumb drive, all sorts of versions, and they were all immune to any kind of, well, this setup. But Mac performed a miracle. He did some things so quickly, I have no idea what he did. But the images are up there on the screen, and you will see one of the things that I was hoping for is the ability to use the cursor. And so there it is. And you can see the cursor. So here we are, high tech, ready to go. You've heard the title, Unintended Consequences, Misperceptions and Interceptions in the New Communication System from the 1880s to 1917. What you see on the screen there is the approximation of the number of submarine telegraph cables that existed in the 1890s. This is taken from a book that was published, I think, in 1898. The interesting thing, the remarkable thing, is if you go back to 1865, that screen would be entirely blank. There were none. There were two dumb cables that had been laid and had failed. So in a period between 1866 and 1898, there was an immense outpouring of investments and the placement of these cables beneath the ocean. Cable, to be brief about it, is about this big around. The copper wire transmits the electrical signal. It's insulated by a substance called gutta percha, and that's usually surrounded by either iron or steel cables for strength. And so that's, in a sense, what you're looking at on the screen there. In the early 1900s, there were approximately 250,000 miles of cables laid. Where's Richard Henderson? Yeah, so there's your number for you. We had a standing joke. This is an inside joke, but Richard and I, approximately 250,000. So this is a good number for you to write down. That there had been a shortage of numbers. The numbers had disappeared on campus here back in the 70s. I'm sure it's a shock to Dr. Smith. The numbers were being kept in a small office in Stokes Hall. And some of our colleagues overheard this conversation and thought it was true. Do you remember that? See, he doesn't remember it. Okay, that's good. But at any rate, there's a number for you. In 1894, some individuals who were very proud of this system, including Thomas Edison, arranged a demonstration. And they had a setup so that they sent a telegram from New York, and you can follow it. It doesn't quite show up entirely on here. From New York to the west coast of the United States, back through Canada, across the Atlantic Ocean, and then all the way off this map to Japan, and then back again across the Atlantic Ocean, back to New York, several thousand miles, and it made this transit in 47 minutes. Same group transmitted another telegram, and I'll follow this one because it does show up on our map, through the United States, down to Galveston, then across Mexico, along the west coast of South America, across the Andes, back through Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, up to Lisbon, over to England, and then back to New York, and this transit was made in 21 minutes. And you know, that may not mean much to us today, but when you consider the alternative ways of moving messages, the fastest way possible was by ship, and it would have taken several weeks, if not months, to carry a similar message. So this was an impressive accomplishment. There was an outburst of enthusiasm. This new communication system would be wonderful for business, and it was. It would also bring on world peace, and it didn't. So David Nichols and some others and I are looking into how the system was actually used. What were the results of its use? And that brings me to an opportunity to explain or define my terms. By unintended consequences, what we mean here is that the main actor, the person sending the message, doesn't get the results intended. Misperceptions in the messages result from three possible scenarios. Number one, the original message is wrong or in some way defective, or the receiver who gets the message doesn't understand it or makes poor use of it, or the third possibility is that the message itself is garbled as it is sent. And that brings me, I'm going to try to change slides here. So here we go. This is exciting, and we did it. This is the mechanism that was used to send the messages in the 1860s and 70s and 80s and in the Western Hemisphere all the way up to the 20th century. It's called a mirror galvanometer. The signal comes in through these wires in the back. This is, as you can see over on this side, a concave mirror. The only electricity in the room is in these wires. The light in the room comes from a kerosene lantern. Keep in mind, in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and most places in the 90s, there was no power grid. There was no electric lighting, so they had to use a kerosene lantern. The room is absolutely dark, except for this lantern and another small lantern I'll tell you about later. So the light is focused by the mirror and reflects a beam of light on this row, which is the alphabet. So a carefully calibrated and usually weak signal comes in, moves the mirror slightly, and it pauses for a few seconds on a letter that is illuminated. And it's up to the receiver to write that letter down. And that's how these messages were transmitted. It actually took two people to work in the room. One to watch the light, beam of light move across the letters and call out the letter, and the second person would write them down. And in a way, it's amazing that so few errors were made. These people were especially trained, highly specialized individuals. There was really only one school that trained these people. It's located in Porthcurno, Cornwall, in England. U.S. companies, even some French and German companies, would use English-trained telegraphers. You might be familiar with Porthcurno and its environment if you watch the ETV series Doc Martin, because it's set in Cornwall. And I spent a lot of very pleasant hours in Porthcurno, where the archive is located now. And you really get a sense of what life is like in Cornwall in that series. It's a remarkable place. I also need to define interceptions. We're not using interception in the way that we use it in football. That is, a forward pass is intercepted and the receiver doesn't get it. In communications, in telegraphy, the message gets through to the intended receiver, but there's an outsider who also gets the message. That's very important, because part of this is the deception that it has not been intercepted. Otherwise, the person to whom it's intended is not going to go on their course of action. And the hacker or the interceptor doesn't get an advantage. So we're using interception in that sense. I'm going to talk about 3 crises, 3 case studies involving communications, and we'll see how problems in communications affected historical events in these circumstances. The first is the Bering crisis. And I mentioned that George Westinghouse, very famous businessman, name is still with us, he was in the process of building the electrical grid for the United States in 1890, and he wanted to go to his favorite bank in New York and get a loan for about $500,000. Now keep in mind, $500,000 back then was a lot of money. $500,000 to continue his work. Well, on the weekend of November 15, 1890, he discovered that he'd been turned down. Somebody turned down George Westinghouse. Well, what's going on? Well, there's a big problem in the banks. There are rumors that Barings Bank in London is in trouble and is about to fail. Well, that led to all sorts of restrictions on credit and loans. And indeed, Westinghouse eventually builds the grid, of course, but indeed Barings was in trouble. The problem for Barings was that they were overextended in a lot of activities, but most of their problems centered in Argentina. So, in essence, and now let's go back here. Westinghouse over here, here's the Barings problems in England as a result of difficulties down in Buenos Aires. So the communication system made possible for this information to move in a few days. And the consequences, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, will lead us to the Depression of 1893. There were contractions in the US economy, the British economy, the European economy, the Latin American economy. It was a very serious depression. I've seen one estimate places unemployment rate in the United States at 25%. So the causes of this depression are very large, and I'm not about to explain those. But what I do try to focus on is what you would call the trigger. What was the immediate event that led to this crisis? And the trigger takes us to the Buenos Aires Water Supply and Drainage Company Limited. This was a company that was set up in Argentina to build a modern water supply, sewage, and storm drain system. Buenos Aires is one of the fastest growing cities in the world, very prosperous city. Seemed like a good thing to do, but it didn't work out. What we focus on are the actions, or I might say the inaction, of a young man employed by Barings Bank. His name is Nicholas Bauer, B-O-U-W-E-R, Dutch origin. He'd been working for Barings as their man in Buenos Aires since 1876, and he had developed a method of communicating with the bosses back in London, where Barings' headquarters was located. He would send a very brief telegram about problems, followed by a second, followed by a third, and if necessary, a letter that would summarize those 3 telegrams. It would take longer to arrive. But there was a big crisis in Argentina in 1880. Bauer supplied a steady stream of information, very efficient, very effective. Barings avoided any problems, looked good for the company, looked good for young Bauer, okay? As I was going through the Barings archive, which has the letters and telegrams from Bauer, I was shocked to see in one of these letters a complaint that went on for a paragraph. Bauer was saying the cost of living here in Buenos Aires is much greater than I thought it would be. I've incurred a heavy debt. I need a raise. Well, no response, no response. So Bauer actually went to London. The bank agreed to pay off his debt, 1,500 pounds worth, but no raise. So Bauer goes back. He's still Barings' representative in Buenos Aires, but he takes a second job with Samuel B. Hale and Company, a merchant house. And essentially Bauer moves his desk, so to speak, into Hale and Company. He handles the Barings business, but he also is working for Hale and Company. Well, Barings approved that. They thought it would take some of the pressure off his financial situation. But that leads us to the Buenos Aires Water Supply and Drainage Company. I'm sure you've heard of talk of this at Food Line and Piggly Wiggly and a lot of other places. And that was the problem. Hale and Company arranged this whole thing, putting contractors together, and then enticed Barings to support it by issuing stock based on what you see here. This is a prospectus. And so, by 1887, Barings is busily at work doing this. Well, there are rumors circulating that things aren't going well down in Buenos Aires. But Barings hears nothing from Bauer, the man who has been such a reliable informant for so many years. Prospectus is issued, the stock is for sale, no buyers. Total amount involved for Barings, 8,500,000 pounds. And here's some more numbers, Richard. If you translate that into current pounds, it's close to, close to £1 billion, which would be well over $1 billion today. So this was a big deal. What's going on? Well, problem is that Argentina is actually too enticing. Argentina has a wonderful topsoil. It's about a foot thick in some places. Wheat grows there, grass for cattle, sheep. You throw money at Argentina and it comes back at you twofold. That was the image that Argentina had in the 1880s, and it seemed to work out that way. But this particular enterprise was not well put together. And in spite of the rumors, Barings went ahead. Well, the British historian H.S. Fearns, who spent most of his academic life looking at British investments in Argentina, characterized this situation as, this is a quote, delirium beyond control. Sounds a lot like irrational exuberance that is maybe a little bit more familiar to us. vast overinvestment. The leaders at Barings Bank, and this is Lord Revelstoke, a very formidable looking fellow, sends his son, John Baring, to Buenos Aires to investigate the situation. What young John Baring found appalled him. He said the prospectus that you just saw was hideously misleading. The entire project was a shambles. He goes into the offices of Samuel Hale and Company and immediately fires Nicholas Bauer. He sacked him, as the British say. He intimidated the other members of the firm and entered into a series of complicated negotiations involving Barings, the Argentine government, the British government, some other bankers in Europe. The situation is resolved. Barings is saved by a bailout because the people there in London decided that it was too big to fail. Similar language. In fact, there's an Argentine economist who has written on this 2008 crisis, comparing it to the 1890 crisis, and he sees some similarity. So the communications problem takes us to Bauer. Bauer did not send the messages he should have sent. He did not even use the communication system. In a sense, this is a misperception based on no information. Lord Revelstoke, the head of the bank, was very confident about Argentina, more confident than he should have been, but he got no information to the contrary. So I liken this to the situation in the Arthur Conan Doyle story, Sherlock Holmes, Silver Blaze. The problem came, the culprit was revealed, a dog that did not bark. The dog who should have barked was Nicholas Bauer. He should have barked out a warning, and he didn't because he was too familiar with the culprits involved. Moving on to case study number 2, which is called entrapment by cable. That takes us to, this will help, the work of this man, Spanish Admiral Pascual Cervera. That's not a widely known name, but he was involved in the Spanish-American War. He was the head of the Spanish squadron that attempted to relieve Spanish forces in Cuba in 1898. Cervera, well, just a brief reminder about the Spanish-American War. The United States is fighting Spain, but the big issue centers around Cuba. You might remember the explosion of the battleship Maine in February 1898 and other problems between the United States and Spain. Okay, the United States is in the war. In order to win the war, the United States has to invade Cuba, where the Spanish have a few 100,000 soldiers who are trying to put down the Cuban rebellion for independence. The United States, in a sense, is intervening to help the Cubans gain their independence, although there was some restrictions on that after the war was over. The challenge to Cervera, who was the admiral of the Spanish squadron that was trying to help Spanish forces in Cuba, his challenge was to get his ships into harbor in Cuba. He was ordered across the Atlantic, and to make a long story short, he made it. Here's his squadron entering around the island of Martinique to Curacao, then around Jamaica, and into Santiago Harbor. The Caribbean at this time was alive with telegraphic signals back and forth. The United States and Spain are both trying to track down each other. The Spanish are aware that U.S. fleet has blockaded Cuba except for Santiago. And so Cervera figures that out, and that's where he goes. The United States is trying to find Cervera, and they don't find him. This is a major accomplishment in navigation and strategic planning. He gets into Santiago with all of his ships and his crew intact. In the meanwhile, the United States forces, there is an artist's rendering of the Spanish squadron leaving Curacao. This is the island of Cuba, and I'm going to get to this point. Telegraphic cables were important for the Spanish military, Spanish government. So the U.S. Navy decided to cut the cables along the south coast of Cuba off Cienfuegos. This is Cienfuegos right here. The action took place just off the port of Cienfuegos. This would greatly complicate the Spanish government's ability to supervise its forces in this region. And what you see before you now is the only illustration I've ever found of this particular attempt. About 56 U.S. sailors and Marines on 4 boats, whale boats, went along the coast and pulled up the cable. And this is, you get a chance to actually see that. I won't play with it too much, but you can see the sailors gripping the cable. This fellow has a hacksaw, and he's trying to saw it. This man has a grapnel, and he's holding it. They also had sledgehammers, saws. They beat up on it pretty badly. I mean, and thought that they had interrupted the telegraphic communications. Well, unfortunately for them, they hadn't. I mean, I've looked in the records of the cable company, the Cuban submarine cable company in Port Corno, and they report no interruption of service, so it was in service. The sad thing, well, this is war. Spanish troops showed up and started firing at the U.S. Sailors and Marines. And in the Spanish-American War, the Spanish troops actually had pretty good rifles, and some of them were pretty good marksmen. They killed a Marine, they killed a sailor, they wounded 6 others. Over 10% of the people on the ships had been hit. Reinforcements arrived, more rifle fire, and so the troops withdrew. So the cable remained intact. Admiral Cervera, his fleet safely in Santiago Harbor, was on orders to report immediately to the governor on the island of Cuba, who's in Havana, and so he did so by telegram. Well, he was following orders. The message got through, but it was intercepted. The United States had a spy. Actually, it was a Cuban. His name was Domingo Villaverde, and he read the cable, immediately sent the message through what was called a Key West network, which was a network of spies that the U.S. Army Signal Corps had put in place. It gets to Washington, and within a few hours, U.S. forces in the Caribbean know where Cervera's fleet is. It wasn't really a fleet, it was a squadron of 4 battle cruisers and 3 torpedo boats. Well, a lot of the commanders in the U.S. Navy were convinced that Cervera would go not to Santiago, but over here to Cienfuegos. So there's a debate going on. They still can't believe it. They can't believe that the entire squadron is there. Any one ship can be a menace to the United States because the U.S. has to move several thousand troops by transport ships. The U.S. Navy was new and modern, but it had no transport ships. And so these are antiquated side wheelers, going to be overloaded moving slowly. So a torpedo boat, which I have inconveniently located further back here, torpedo boat, which was a new weapon, similar look in terms of its profile like a submarine, but it doesn't submerge. It's not nearly as fast as the PT boats of World War II, but it could launch torpedoes, and torpedoes could sink a battleship. They could sink a transport ship. So we have to have absolute certainty that all of the Spanish vessels are in Santiago Bay and can be blockaded and held there. And so here we have actually a local person who participates. The Admiral Sampson asked for volunteers, and a young officer named Victor Blue, lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, volunteered. He was a native of Marion, South Carolina. And in one of the most courageous acts in the war, there were a lot of people who claimed courageous acts, but Victor Blue went on shore by himself, met up with a group of Cuban rebels. They escorted him up to a point where he could look over Santiago Bay and identify all of the Spanish ships to know exactly where they were. He knew what they looked like, and he did it, and he returned, and the U.S. was able to blockade Cervera's squadron. Now, Cervera is faced with a difficult decision. He knows that the U.S. Navy outguns him, outmans him. He has very little chance for survival in a direct head-to-head confrontation with the newly built U.S. Navy. His preference would be to stay in Santiago and use a large part of his sailors on land duty to resist the U.S. coming attack on the city of Santiago. All this comes to a head. We have Teddy Roosevelt and a few other people who were with him charging up San Juan Hill, defeating the Spanish. You get the impression that the war was over at this point. That was July 1st, 1898. July 2nd, William Shafter, the U.S. general in charge, went into a funk. He didn't do anything. He ordered discussions about possible withdrawal. Why would he do that? Well, again, heavy casualties. U.S. Forces suffered over 10% killed and wounded. Another day like that, and they would be 20% down. Plus, malaria and yellow fever had started to hit the troops. And Shafter was convinced that the best he could do was to hold what he had. Cervera, on the other side, thinks maybe we can defend Santiago and wear the Yankees down. But Cervera is a loyal sailor. He gets orders from Havana to take out the fleet. These orders originate in Spain, reinforced by the governor in Havana. Cervera's assessment of the situation is much more realistic because he realizes when his ships go up against the U.S. Navy, they don't have a chance. To stay and participate in a land fight would be a different matter. But he has his orders. And so on the morning of July the 3rd, the Spanish fleet or squadron exits Santiago Bay. Cervera's ship is the first in line. He has the band playing as they go out to face a very grim possibility. This is an artist rendering of the Battle of Santiago Bay. These are the U.S. ships closer to us, and here are the Spanish ships. I assume that is Cervera's ship. The outcome was pretty much what you would expect. This is a handwritten diagram that was in one of these old books that I found. These are the Spanish vessels coming out. Here's the U.S. blockade at 9:40 in the morning. You can see the 9:40 there, yes, yeah. By 1:20 p.m., it was all over. All the Spanish ships were either sunk or run aground. The one that got the longest distance down the coast here was the Colón, named for Christopher Columbus. It was the last ship to be afloat for Spain, named for the man who, 406 years earlier had discovered land for and claimed land for Spain in the Americas. After the war was, Cervera survives, just barely. The U.S. sailors immediately recognize him. He's treated very well. He turns over his letters and correspondence to the United States. He's shipped back to Spain, where he's greeted as a hero. So he did his duty, and fortunately for him, he survived the battle. But 300 Cuban sailors were killed, 150 were wounded. It was a resounding defeat. Cervera never expressed bitterness, but his second in command, Captain Victor Concas, wrote a memoir of this battle, and he complained bitterly about the centralization of command. That was the reason that the squadron was lost. This is a parallel situation to what John Keegan describes in his book on intelligence and war in the battle off Coronel, which is a port in Chile in World War I, where a British squadron encountered 4 German cruisers under orders to seek them out and destroy them. The British were under orders, and they were terribly mismatched, and the British suffered their worst defeat since the Napoleonic Wars. All the British ships were sunk. The admiral was killed. Only one, not all were sunk. One escaped, but the others were either sunk or run aground. Centralized command, made possible through the communication system. So, by way of summary, briefly, Cervera's presence was discovered because he did his duty and he sent the message, and it was intercepted. So the U.S. knew where he was, and he was eventually blockaded. Then the same telegraph system sends him the message, you're supposed to take your men out of Santiago Bay. His actions and his predicament are largely a result of the use of communications. My third case study, and I'm going to have to move along quickly here, involves the Zimmermann telegram. This is I guess a more famous case. Those are some of the U.S. Warships. But this is the headline in the New York Times the day after the Zimmermann telegram was revealed. Arthur Zimmermann, was a German foreign minister. He sent a telegram to the president of Mexico, Venustiano Carranza, in January of 1917, offering to make an alliance and a deal. If Mexico entered the war against the United States, providing the United States enters World War I, if Mexico would join in with Germany against the United States, then Mexico would receive, in case of victory, would receive in compensation Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. This telegram was intercepted by British intelligence and held for a while, and then turned over to the United States and released to the press. The response in the United States was pretty instantaneous. On March 1st, the day this headline appeared, from New York to Los Angeles, there were rather angry editorial expressions about what Germany had done and the unity that existed in the United States. According to the Los Angeles Tribune, all differences are extinguished, all racial prejudices are obliterated, and the men and women unitedly support the president in the pride and strength of their common devotion to their country. The Zimmermann telegram stirred up a firestorm of anger in the United States and a huge surge of support for President Woodrow Wilson and the possibility of entering the war. This telegram, of course, is a primary example of an interception. The British intercepted the telegram. As Friedrich Katz, who's a scholar, studied this area a great deal, said in his book on the subject, one of the greatest spy stories of all times. The man who was responsible is British Admiral Reginald Hall, who is in charge of what is called Room 40 in the British Admiralty, which is actually a whole suite of offices where 900 communication specialists and code breakers worked to try to break into messages. For a while, I thought I was going to be able to simplify this, but then David Nichols sent me an email. Things are much more complicated than anybody really has been able to appreciate. And you have to blame Reginald Hall. He was trying to cover his tracks. He didn't want the Germans to know that he'd broken into their messages. He also didn't want the United States to know that the United States was reading U.S. telegraphic messages. And one of the things that's so hard to explain is the United States allowed the Germans to use their code system, their cable system, in hopes of promoting peace. So the British read the Zimmermann telegram as part of a set of messages sent through the U.S. cable connection. The British are certainly going to read German cables, but they shouldn't have been reading U.S. cables. So this has to be covered up very carefully. So Admiral Hall used all sorts of devices, including false stories about where they got the cable from. But they actually did get the cable. It was verified. The Germans, some Germans at first thought it was a fake, a British falsification. But 3 days later, Zimmermann admitted, yes, I did send the telegram. There's a tendency to think that this was a foolish thing to do. What in the world could Mexico do in a war against the United States? Well, you have to keep in mind the circumstances. In 1916, the year before, General John Pershing had been in pursuit of Pancho Villa in northern Mexico, and his troops had been there for about a year, and they never even saw Villa. The U.S. had mobilized over 100,000 men along the U.S. border in order to protect that 2,000-mile border. Estimates are that it would require 250,000 U.S. troops to avoid raids like Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. So there is some logic to this. But Zimmermann also was pursuing a line of negotiation with the Mexicans. There was not just one Zimmermann telegram, there were actually 4, followed by a letter. And these negotiations continue January, February, March, and into April. And even after the United States entered the war, Carranza, the Mexican government, continues to negotiate with the Germans. So this is not as far-fetched as it might seem in terms of the German purpose. Mexico, of course, turned it down. The impact in the United States, well, this verse is Arthur Zimmermann. That's President of Mexico, Carranza. Here's Reginald Hall. Very hard to get a picture of Reginald Hall. He was camera shy, apparently, but that's the best I could come up with. These are some of the editorial cartoons that came out in U.S. press in the wake of the Zimmermann telegram. See, this is the Zimmermann note exploding in the face of the Kaiser. This is the Kaiser tempting Mexico. And here, do a little blow up. Kaiser has a particular problem with his feet. One looks very much like a hoof there. Here's another Kaiser whispering to innocent-looking Mexican. And then here's a thing that upset people not only in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, but also California, because California is intended perhaps for Japan. One of the curious things that I just ran across a couple of days ago is that William Randolph Hearst made a serial 15-part episode, motion picture, about, it was called Patria, and it was about a Japanese-Mexican invasion of the United States. The thing that kind of surprised me is this motion picture was released on January 15th, 1917. Zimmermann dated his telegram, wrote his telegram, on January the 19th. How did Hearst do that? I don't know. This was a very successful serial. The star was Irene Castle, the wife of Vernon Castle, who did a lot for ballroom dancing. And the villain was played by Warner Olin, who started out as a very Japanese-looking villain. But after the serial started, President Wilson, when he found out the Japanese were not going to participate with Mexico and Germany, told Hearst to change that. And so Warner Olin's name, it was originally a Japanese name, but in the subtitles for the silent film, he becomes Miguel Morales. So that was a face-saving device. I think we can see from these three examples that the use of cable communications did not always benefit those who were trying to gain an advantage. The House of Baring did not receive the messages or the information that it should have from its man in Buenos Aires. It cost them dearly, and in fact, Lord Revelstoke, the fellow we saw on the screen, was removed as head of the bank. The bailout package was completed. Poor Admiral Cervera, he did his duty, and he was intercepted, so his presence was discovered, and his orders from Madrid and Havana to go out resulted in a disaster for his fleet. Zimmermann was trying to negotiate. The Mexicans were willing to negotiate and wanted to negotiate, but the result was an outburst of anger in the United States that contributed to the U.S. declaration of war. I do some sort of analytical work here, and I see that we're right at 5 o'clock, so I think I should relent a little bit. But one of the curious things about the twists and turns that come out of the use of communications, the Germans reached the decision that they could not rely on cable communications because the British really had the upper hand. They controlled the cables. They had the boats that could place the cables, raise them, cut them. Nobody else could match them. So the Germans invested their money in radio communications. And if you're going to use radio, you're broadcasting. So you need a very complex code system. So the Germans came up with the Enigma Machine, which could change the codes every day automatically. This is the system that the Germans used in World War II. The British respond to that by assembling a large number of gifted people at Bletchley Park, where they spend a lot of time and effort and money trying to decipher the Enigma code, and that leads to the development of the bomba, or what really amounts to a computer. And so as we live in the last part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st century, all these things have sort of come into play. Instead of copper cables, we have fiber optics. But we still have radio or wireless communication or Wi-Fi. And the bomba is employed as a computer. And all of this has been wired together. And now we tend to be suspicious of people who hack into messages. We here in South Carolina are particularly sensitive to that, but a lot of people have been hacked into. But it's interesting to keep in mind that the original hackers who were so good at what they did were the British, who hacked into German radio communications in the Enigma mysteries in World War II. So I think at this point I should conclude my remarks and see if we have any questions or comments someone would like to make.
Any questions for Dr. Briton? I have one, John.
Okay.
Why did Zimmermann admit that the telegram was genuine? That seemed to me to be a pretty stupid thing to do.
That's a good question. That's a very good question.
If you wanted to mislead, that would have been the opportunity.
Well, first of all, there's a new book. There's always a new book. Thomas Bogard, B-O-G-A-R-D-T, has written a relatively new book, 2012, on the Zimmermann telegram. He makes a fairly convincing case that Zimmermann relied on the advice of a fellow by the name of Chemnitz, who was a specialist in East Asia and had just shifted over to the Mexican desk in the German Foreign Ministry. And Chemnitz thought that he could get Mexico and Japan together. But Chemnitz, according to Bogart, was not a very astute fellow, and he just made a kind of silly mistake. And for some reason, Zimmermann picked up on this and thought it might work. So Zimmermann's original action in this context doesn't appear to be based on a lot of logical reasoning. Germany was in a pretty tight situation. But there's a more, I think, rational judgment about Zimmermann in this case. He didn't know how much the British knew. He knew that they had intercepted the cable. He thought they might know more. And for him to deny it, and then the British come along after that and show, indeed, Zimmermann was aware of this and have more evidence, it would make him look even more foolish. So I think that's a reasonable answer. One other point I'll make, I ran across this. Bulldog Drummond, famous British character. The people who worked with British intelligence created their own set of myths. A lot of talented writers, Graham Greene, Somerset Maugham, and Ian Fleming. And from this environment came a mystique about intelligence and espionage and spying. And Bulldog Drummond was one of these, written by a fellow by the name of Herman McNeil. And this persists down to the present day in various forms. So I just thought I would add that. That's an interesting thing that showed up on the internet.